My name is Claire Henderson. I am 34 years old. I sell other people's memories for a living. I know what a grandmother's china cabinet is worth in a room full of strangers holding numbered paddles. I know what a man's tools go for, when his family cannot agree on anything except the date of the auction. I know the price of a life packed into cardboard boxes and set on folding tables under fluorescent lights. I also know what gets hidden inside things. The night my sister told my parents I had stolen from them, I was in the back seat of my father's car. My 6-week-old son was in a carrier strapped across my chest. I had one cardboard box on the seat beside me. My father was behind the wheel. He did not turn around. 7 years later, I was standing at an auction podium in Louisville, Kentucky, with the gavel in my right hand, when Lot 47 was wheeled in on a dolly. I recognized it the moment I saw the walnut case. I knew exactly what was inside. My sister was sitting in row 3. She had no idea I had already read the catalog. She had no idea what I was about to open. I need to back up. You do not get a night like that out of nowhere. You do not get driven out of a house with a newborn unless something has been building for a long time. In my family, it had been building since before I could name it. Maybe since I was born. We grew up in a brick house on Brownsboro Road in Louisville. My father, Gary Henderson, worked 31 years in freight logistics for a company on the south end of town. My mother, Marlene, cleaned houses 3 days a week and managed everything else the other 4. My older sister Patricia, whom everyone called Pat, was 2 years ahead of me in school, 2 years ahead of me in everything. She graduated first. She married first. She bought her house in St. Matthews first. And she understood, before I did, that being the favored child in that house came down to a simple principle. Do not embarrass the family, and do not ask for more than your allotted share. Pat was excellent at both. I was not. When I was 25, I met a man named Donnie at a bar on Bardstown Road. He had an easy laugh, and a truck that smelled like sawdust. We dated 11 months. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after he stopped returning my calls. His mother told me he had relocated to Nashville. Then his mother stopped answering too. I told my parents at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in October. My mother set down her coffee very slowly. My father pushed back his chair and said he needed something from the garage. He was in the garage for 20 minutes. When he came back, he said, "We will figure something out." That was the last time either of them used that word in connection with what I was going through. I kept the baby. James Gary Henderson was born on a Tuesday in March at Norton Healthcare. He weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces. He had dark eyes and a jaw that came from my grandmother's side of the family, which I did not point out to anyone, because my grandmother and my mother had not spoken in 11 years, over a matter involving a savings account, and something said at Easter that apparently could not be unsaid. Pat came to the hospital once. She stayed 14 minutes. She said he looks healthy, and she was glad everything had gone okay. She did not hold him. My mother came twice. She held James for 6 minutes on the first visit. She said he is gaining weight well. She did not say his name. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment off Shelby Street at $740 a month. I took a part-time position at an estate sale company called Crestwood Liquidators doing intake and tagging. I had a good eye for furniture, and a steadiness with objects that the owner, a man named Bill Garrett, said was uncommon in someone my age. He said most people who worked estate sales got attached to the things. They wanted to know the histories. I wanted to know the value. I brought James to work in his carrier for the first 6 weeks. I set it under the intake table, and he slept, while I tagged crystal and silverware and sets of dishes from households that no longer had anyone living in them. Bill brought in a small fan one day and positioned it near the table. He did not say anything about it. The first 2 Christmases, after James was born, I went to my parents' house on Brownsboro Road. I sat at the table, and passed the dishes, and answered questions about the apartment. Pat brought her husband Derek, and his stepson, from a previous marriage. The boy was 9 and politely behaved. James sat in my lap, or in a borrowed bouncy seat pushed to the side of the room against the wall. My mother did not offer to hold him. The third Christmas, Marlene called 2 weeks before the holiday, and said Pat's stepson had developed a nut sensitivity, and they were simplifying the menu this year, keeping it to close family. I said I understood. I did not ask what close family meant. That Christmas Eve I put James to bed at 7:30, and sat on the floor of my apartment eating crackers, and watching a movie about a woman who moved to Italy, and started her life over. I thought about how the movie never shows what she does in February, when the novelty has worn off, and it is just cold, and she has to figure out how to pay for things. The fourth Christmas I did not wait for the call. I took James to a McDonald's on Bardstown Road, and ordered him a Happy Meal. He ate all the fries first, which I had also done as a child, and I sat across from him in the booth, and thought about how much of himself he had assembled, from nothing, from just existing in the world, without anyone handing him a template. James's first birthday I hosted a small party, with 3 mothers, from the apartment complex. We had a grocery store sheet cake, and streamers from the dollar section at Target. Pat sent a card with a pre-printed message. No signature. I put it on the counter, and looked at it for a moment, and then put it in the recycling. His second birthday, nothing came from Pat. His third birthday, nothing. His fourth, a gift bag appeared at my apartment door, while I was at work. The tag said Happy Birthday, Love Auntie Pat. James looked at the tag, and asked who Auntie Pat was. I said she is your mother's sister. He thought about it, and said is she nice? I said she can be. He accepted that, and moved on to the bag. I tell you all of this not to catalog grievances, but because you cannot understand a particular night, without understanding the years that manufactured it. And the night they put me out of that house was not a single event. It was the compression of several years of smaller choices, into 1 hour and 40 minutes. James was 6 weeks old. We had been staying at the house on Brownsboro Road since I came home from the hospital. My apartment had a mold problem in the bathroom wall that the landlord was addressing on his own timeline. My mother had offered the guest room while it was being remediated. It was the most direct kindness she had extended to me since I told her I was keeping the baby. I accepted without analyzing it too closely. I was upstairs feeding James on a Tuesday evening in April, when I heard her voice coming up through the floor. She, my sister, did not usually call on weekday evenings. I heard the cadence of it before I heard the words. The tone was the one she used when she was being helpful to my parents at my expense, which was a particular register I had learned to identify before I learned to articulate what it meant. I heard 2 sentences before anything else. She stole from you. Make her leave. Then I heard my name. Then I heard a number. My father knocked on the bedroom door 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides. He was still in his work clothes. He said there was a situation. He said Marlene was missing $3,400 from her purse. He said it had been missing for 2 weeks. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, with James in my lap. I looked at my father's face. He was looking at the floor. I said I did not know anything about that. He said Pat believed I may have taken it during one of my trips downstairs in the night. I said I did not take anything. He looked at the ceiling, and then back at me. He said maybe it would be better if you and James stayed somewhere else for now. I said the apartment still has mold in the walls. The baby cannot be in mold. He said we will help you sort that out. He did not say I believe you. He did not say let me call Pat back and tell her she is wrong. He said we will help you sort that out, and he went back downstairs. I packed in 1 hour and 40 minutes. I put James in the carrier and strapped it across my chest. I put what I could fit into one cardboard box. Diapers, the small things, a change of clothes, his blanket. I carried the box under my arm and came downstairs. My father was at the kitchen counter with his coffee mug. He was standing. He did not say anything. His mug was probably worth $8. The backsplash tiles were the originals, from the 1970s renovation, pale yellow, about 40 cents each. I counted these things without meaning to. I had always done that when my hands were full, and my body needed something to hold on to. My mother was in the living room. She was crying in the still way she had, where her face stayed composed, but her hands kept moving. She said, "I am sorry, Claire." I said, "I know, Mom." I did not look back. It was 9:17 in the evening. I drove to a gas station and called my friend Dana, who had an apartment in the Germantown neighborhood. She said, "Come right now." I drove there, with James asleep against my chest, and the cardboard box in the back seat, and $312 in my checking account. I slept on Dana's couch for 11 days. The mold remediation in my apartment finished in 2 weeks. I moved back in. I did not hear from my parents for 22 days. When Marlene finally called, she said she hoped James was doing well. She did not mention $3,400. She did not say we were wrong, or we are sorry, or your sister was lying. She said, "I hope you are settling back in all right." I said, "We are fine, Mom." I never went back to that house. For years into working for Bill Garrett, Bill retired and sold Crestwood Liquidators to a couple from Jeffersontown who converted it into a general junk removal service. They needed people with trucks and strong backs. They did not need someone who could identify a Seth Thomas movement by the sound of its escapement. I was 31 years old, with a 4-year-old, and no position. I spent 3 days going through listings. I applied to 2 property management companies, and a hotel chain looking for inventory staff. I also found a posting on the Kentucky Auctioneers Association board. Wickers Estate Auctions, East End, Louisville. Apprentice position, experience preferred, will train the right candidate. Apply in person. I almost did not go. James was at daycare the morning I drove out to the address. It was a converted warehouse on a side street 2 blocks from the Ohio River. The parking lot had a faded painted sign on the asphalt that said Wickers Estate Auctions, established 1974, and underneath in smaller letters, "Every object has a story. We respect both." The woman who answered the door was Dorothy Elaine Wickers. She was 63 years old. She had silver hair cut short and practical, reading glasses pushed onto her forehead, a work apron over a green cardigan, and ink on her left thumb from writing lot numbers. She looked at me and said, "You are here about the position." I said yes. She said, "Come in." She gave me a tour of the intake floor before she asked me anything about myself. She walked me through the staging area, the photography station, the catalog production desk. She picked up a small clock from the sorting table and asked me to tell her what I thought it was worth. I said it was a Seth Thomas movement, probably from the 1880s. The case had been refinished once, but the hands were original. I would open the bidding at $45 and expect to close at 80 to 90 depending on the room. She set it down without comment and said, "Follow me to the office." In the office she had a photograph on the desk in a small silver frame. A man in his mid-30s, dark hair, a kind of laugh that came through even in still photography. She saw me look at it. She said, "That is my son Brendan." I said, "He looks like you." She said, "Everyone says that." There was something in the way she said it that told me not to ask a follow-up question. She hired me that afternoon at $23 an hour to start. I went home and sat at my kitchen table after I picked up James from daycare. He was drawing at the other end of the table. I had the Wickers business card between my fingers. I turned it over once. I had two options. I could treat this as another entry-level position, something to hold the calendar together, while I looked for something with a clearer ceiling. Or I could learn everything Dorothy Wickers knew about this specific work, and become someone I could not have described at 25 sitting in the back seat of my father's car. I called and confirmed I would start Monday. That was the decision. It did not feel large at the time. It never does. If you are still with me, stay. What Dorothy taught me in those years matters to what happened in that auction room. I do not want you to miss it. Dorothy ran Wickers estate auctions the way people run things that have cost them something real, with precision and without performance. She had built the company from a weekend business she and her husband Roy started in 1974. Roy died in 2003. She had run it, without a partner ever since. The business had grown to the point where she had hired and let go of 7 employees over 20 years, and she described each of them to me once, accurately and without apparent bitterness, as though they were lots she had passed on at auction. She said the problem with most people who worked estate sales was that they could not separate the object from the person who had owned it. They wanted to honor the dead. That was not the job. The job was to move the object to someone who would use it. The honor came from doing that correctly. I understood her without difficulty. I had been separating objects from sentiment since I was 25. She taught me appraisal in sequence. Condition first. Provenance second. Comparables third. She said never let feeling into the appraisal. The moment you feel sorry for a piece, she said, you have lost the ability to value it accurately. She also said this, keep your records. Every lot number, every transaction, every estimate versus realized price. Write it down. She had 31 years of ledgers in a back room she had never discarded. She said you never know which number someone will want to dispute years from now. You want to be the person in the room who can say I wrote it down. I wrote everything down. Brendan came into the story gradually, the way a subject does when a person is not yet ready to say it all at once. I had known from the photograph on Dorothy's desk that he had existed. I knew from the way she said his name the one time she introduced it that something had happened. 3 months into the job, I asked her directly whether Brendan was still in Louisville. She said Brendan died in 2019. She said it the way facts get said, after they have been repeated enough times to wear smooth. Heart attack. He was 44 years old. He had been living in Atlanta for 9 years. They had not spoken for 7 of those years. She said some situations reach a point where neither person knows how to make the first call, and you wait too long, and then the call becomes something that cannot be made. She paused. She said the worst part is that it is not dramatic. There is no fight. There is no final bad thing. There is just a space that keeps expanding, until one day you find out by phone, from a stranger in Atlanta, that the space is now permanent. She set the photograph of Brendan on the auction podium the first time I saw her run a sale. She placed it at the left front corner, facing the room. I asked her once if it bothered the bidders. She said the ones who found it unsettling were the ones who needed to think about why. I put my name forward for every appraisal assignment Dorothy offered. I went to homes in the Highlands, in Anchorage, in Prospect, in Crescent Hill, where the Victorian houses had attics that had not been opened in 50 years. I got good at talking to families in the middle of estate situations. I did not offer them false comfort. I told them what things were worth, and I told them the timeline. I was accurate, and I was steady, and I did not perform grief back at them. Dorothy began taking me to the larger estates in my 2nd year. She began copying me on the complex appraisal correspondence. In the fall of that year, she gave me my first solo gavel assignment, a small estate in the Beachmont neighborhood. 31 lots. I cleared $33,000 in 2 hours. She said you have a gift for timing the room. James turned 6 the spring of my 3rd year at Wickers. I brought him to the warehouse on a Saturday morning to show him the work. Dorothy was there doing intake. She crouched down to his level, which I had not expected from her, and asked his name. He said James. She said, James, what do you think all of these objects have in common? He looked around the staging floor for a moment, and said they all used to belong to someone else. She stood up, and said to me, you are doing something right. She added his name to the visitor log under employees. She did not explain why. In the 4th year, Dorothy's cardiologist identified a problem with her heart. She told me on a Thursday afternoon between 2 appraisal calls. She delivered it the way she delivered most significant information. Factually and without ceremony. She said it was manageable for now, but the long-term prognosis was not favorable. She said she had been thinking about the business, and what she wanted for it. She said Brendan had been the answer she had worked toward for 20 years, and she had waited too long to have that conversation, and now, that answer was not available. She looked at me across the intake desk. She said she would like me to take over the company when she could no longer run it. I said I had been there 4 years. She said she knew. She said Roy had left the business to her, after running it for 29 years. She had worked alongside him for 23 of those. She said the math was not the point. She said the point was whether the person understood what the work required. I said I believed I did. She said she knew I did. Otherwise she would not be asking. We arranged it with an attorney in Clifton. A structured buyout, over time, with Dorothy retaining consulting rights, until she could no longer exercise them. She updated her will separately. She said she wanted James to know that she had done it in part because of what she had seen in him that Saturday morning on the intake floor. She said tell him a stranger can sometimes see things about a person that the people closest to them have stopped being able to see. I did not tell James right away. I was not sure yet how to explain it. The call about the Henderson estate came in November of my 4th year at Wickers. I had not thought about the house on Brownsboro Road in any specific way for more than 2 years. I thought about my parents the way you think about a chapter that has closed, in the background, requiring no active maintenance. I had spoken to my mother once in the previous 18 months, a 4-minute call that covered nothing that mattered. I had not spoken to Pat since before James started kindergarten. The call came from an attorney's office representing a reverse mortgage servicer. My parents had taken a reverse mortgage on the Brownsboro Road house in 2021. My father had been in a memory care facility since the previous January. My mother had moved in with Pat in St. Matthews. The property needed to be cleared, and the personal property needed to be liquidated. The attorney's assistant said they had gotten our name from a probate attorney in the network. She said the estate had personal property of moderate estimated value, furniture, collectibles, and household goods. She would like to schedule a walkthrough. I wrote down the address. I already knew it. I sat at my desk for several minutes after the call. I had 2 choices. I could refer the job to another firm. There were 3 good ones in Louisville. I could say I have a conflict and send the work somewhere else. No one would question it. Or I could do the job. I called back and scheduled the walkthrough for the following Wednesday. The house on Brownsboro Road looked smaller than I remembered. The landscaping had gone a little loose at the edges. The front porch had a new coat of paint that did not quite match the original trim. The attorney's assistant walked through the rooms with me while I made notes in my catalog notebook. The break front in the dining room, which I estimated at $2,000 to $2,500 based on age and condition. The pressed glass tumbler sets in the kitchen cabinet, $12 each. A watercolor farm scene in the hallway I wanted to examine more carefully. Tools in the garage, accumulated across 30 years of small household repairs. I went to my father's office last. The Seth Thomas grandfather clock was still on the shelf. I stood in front of it. I did not open it yet. I wrote in my notebook, Lot 47. Seth Thomas grandfather clock, walnut case, circa 1885. I opened the glass door, and checked the movement. It was clean. The pendulum was original. The hands were original. I checked the case for any previous repairs, and found one on the rear panel, professionally executed. I noted the condition as very good. Standard practice for clocks of this age and type is to lift the pendulum cradle, and check the felt lining at the base of the mechanism for debris or moisture damage. I lifted the pendulum cradle. There was a piece of paper folded under it, tucked into the felt. I took it out. I unfolded it. It was a half sheet of notebook paper in Marlene's handwriting. The ink had faded, but the letters were clear. At the top of the sheet, a date. April, 7 years ago. Below the date, Pat borrowed $3,400 from my purse while I was at the hospital with Claire. She said she would return it before Claire noticed. She has not returned it. I am writing this down so I remember. I held the paper, and I counted, without meaning to. The clock case, walnut, 1 refinish, $900 in current condition. The pendulum, original brass, $40 as a standalone piece. The movement itself, running well after more than a century, worth more than the sum of its components. 31 seconds. I folded the paper exactly as it had been folded. I placed it back under the pendulum cradle. I closed the clock. I finished the walkthrough. I completed the catalog. Every lot numbered, appraised, and described accurately. I drove back to the warehouse, and sat in my car in the parking lot for 11 minutes looking at the Ohio River 2 blocks west. Then I went inside, and told Dorothy what I had found. She listened to the complete account without interrupting. When I finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to run the auction." She said, "And then?" I said, "And then I am going to open the clock." In front of the room. From the podium. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Make sure the catalog is accurate, and the estimate is fair." I said, "It will be." She said, "I know." She said, "One more thing." She said the clock should not go to a stranger. I said, "I know." She said, "Then plan for that." The auction was scheduled for the second Saturday of February. I spent 8 weeks preparing. 114 lots, catalogued, photographed, and described. I appraised the Seth Thomas clock at $1,150, which was accurate. A walnut case Seth Thomas of that era, in that condition, with original movement and hardware, in a room with knowledgeable bidders, would open at $400 and close somewhere between $900 and $1,300. I set the opening at $400. I did not inform the attorney's office about the note. The note was not a legal instrument. It was a piece of notebook paper in a woman's handwriting inside a clock mechanism. It had no binding effect on the estate. What I did with it was my own business. The first move I made was clean and unremarkable. I sent the complete auction catalog to the Henderson family contact provided by the attorney, which was Pat. Every lot listed, every estimate disclosed, as required by Kentucky auction law. Lot 47, Seth Thomas grandfather clock, walnut case, circa 1885, original movement, estimated $800 to $1,200. I did not call her. I sent the catalog. The second move, I contacted Sandra Greer, the arts and antiques correspondent at the Louisville Courier-Journal, with whom I had worked on 2 previous Wickers sales. I told her the Henderson estate included a period Seth Thomas clock, with a documented family provenance going back to 1931, and that I expected serious collectors. She said she would send a photographer. The third move, I listed the auction, with the Kentucky Antiques Dealers Association newsletter. Within 4 days I had 43 pre-registered bidders, which was high for a residential estate of this size. The fourth move came to me. I had not planned it. Pat called on a Thursday evening 9 days before the auction. I was at the kitchen table going through the catalog for the final time. James was asleep. I saw her number and let it ring 3 times. She said Claire. I said Pat. A pause. She said she had gotten the catalog. I said good. She said she had not known I was doing estate sales. I said I had been doing it 4 years. She said the clock, she had seen lot 47. I said yes. She said Dad told you about that clock. I said he told me about it when I was 16. She said it was supposed to stay in the family. I said the estate is under a reverse mortgage servicer, and the personal property is being liquidated as required. Everything goes to the highest bidder. She, my sister, said there are things in that house that should not go to strangers. I said Pat, every lot in this catalog has been accurately appraised, and will be sold to the highest bidder, as required by the terms of the estate liquidation. Family members are welcome to attend, register, and bid the same as any other participant. She said you are doing this on purpose. I said I am doing my job. She said this is not right, Claire. I said I agree with you. I said a great many things over the past 7 years have not been right. But I am still doing my job. She said goodbye and she hung up. I put the phone face down on the table. I sat with the catalog for 20 more minutes. Then I went to bed. The morning of the auction I woke at 5:47. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The auction was at 10. I needed to be at the warehouse by 8. I thought about Brendan Wickers, who had moved to Atlanta 9 years before he died, and had not spoken to Dorothy for 7 of those years, and had died of a heart attack at 44 in a city where no one knew to call her, until it was already done. I thought about Dorothy setting his photograph on the podium every sale day, so he could see what she had learned too late. I got dressed and drove to the warehouse. Dorothy died on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks before the Henderson auction. Her cardiologist called it an acute cardiac event. It was not medically unexpected. Dorothy had told me the prognosis in clear terms, and I had believed her. But believed and prepared are not the same thing. Dorothy had been at the warehouse the previous Friday. She had looked at the Henderson catalog mock-up. She said the photography was good, and the lot descriptions were clean. She picked up her coffee, and said you are going to be fine. I thought she was talking about the auction. Her attorney called me the following morning. He said everything was in order. The business transfer would proceed as arranged. She had also set aside a personal item for James, a small framed photograph she had kept in her office. A picture of the Ohio River taken, from the bridge, the light flat and gray. There was a note attached in her handwriting. For James, who knows what things are worth. I put the auction on pause for 2 weeks. I came to the warehouse every day, and I kept moving, which was how I had learned to handle most things. The week before the rescheduled auction, I did a final walkthrough of the Henderson lots in the staging area. I came to lot 47. I opened the case the way I always did, before a sale on a significant clock, checking the movement, the pendulum, the winding mechanism. Standard procedure. I lifted the pendulum cradle. The note was still there. I unfolded it again. Pat borrowed $3,400 from my purse while I was at the hospital with Claire. She said she would return it before Claire noticed. She has not returned it. I am writing this down so I remember. I held the paper, and I thought about the sequence that had to have occurred for this note to exist inside this clock. Marlene had been at the hospital while I was in labor with James. Pat had taken the money from her purse during that time. Marlene had come home and discovered the shortage. She had written it down in her own handwriting, with the date at the top. She had folded the paper, and tucked it under the pendulum cradle of the clock my father had promised to give me. And then she had watched them put me out of the house, with a 6-week-old. She had known. She had written it down, and she had said nothing, and she had watched it happen. There is a difference between a woman who was deceived by her daughter, and had no recourse, and a woman who wrote the truth down, and chose to keep it to herself. I had spent 7 years not knowing which one my mother was. I stood in the staging area for a long time. I thought about the 4-minute phone call with her 18 months ago, where she asked how James was doing in school, and I said he was doing well, and she said, "That is good," and we said goodbye, without saying anything that mattered. I thought about every Christmas card returned unopened. I thought about James's birthday gifts going back in a bag to Pat's house 3 years in a row. She had known. I folded the note. I put it back. I closed the clock. I went home and sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight. James was asleep. The apartment was quiet in the way it gets quiet in winter, a deep cold still that settles into the walls even when the heat is on. I let myself feel the full weight of what I now knew, which was different from what I had suspected. Suspicion gives you distance. Certainty does not. I did not call my mother. I did not call Pat. In the morning I got up and made James's lunch and drove him to school, and then drove to the warehouse. I put Dorothy's photograph on the podium. I set Brendan's photograph beside it. I began setting up for the sale. The auction was on a Saturday morning in February, the kind of Louisville cold that comes in flat off the river and settles in the warehouse concrete. I arrived at 7:30. My assistant Marcus had the floor arranged. 114 lots on tables in numbered order, the large furniture along the back wall, the smaller items on folding tables under laminated number cards. The Seth Thomas clock stood on the center table, lit from the left side to show the grain of the walnut case. Pre-registered bidders began arriving at 9:15. By 9:50 I had 38 people in the room. Sandra Greer from the Courier-Journal was in the back row, with a photographer. 3 dealers I recognized from the Kentucky antique circuit. A man with white hair I had seen at 2 previous Wickers sales. Collectors and the general public. Pat arrived at 9:58. My mother was with her. Pat registered at the front table, without looking at me. She was wearing a dark wool coat. She had aged in the years since I had last seen her, which I noted, without dwelling on it. My mother stood just inside the entrance for a moment, with her hands around her purse, the way she had always held it in situations where she was uncertain. She looked around the room. She found my face, and held my gaze for 2 seconds. I held hers for the same 2 seconds, and then I looked down at the catalog on my clipboard. Marcus said 2 minutes. I walked up the 2 steps to the podium. I set the catalog on the stand. On the left corner I placed Dorothy's photograph. On the right corner I placed Brendan's. I looked at the room. I said good morning, and welcome to Wickers Estate Auctions. My name is Claire Henderson. I am the owner and auctioneer of record for this sale. We have 114 lots today, and we will move through them at an even pace. All sales are final. Every lot has been accurately appraised and described in the catalog you received. If you have a question about a specific lot, raise your paddle, and I will pause. I took a breath. I said, let's begin. We moved through the first 46 lots in 1 hour and 23 minutes. I had the rhythm of the room by lot 8, and I held it steady through the full run. The break front closed at $2,300. A set of pressed glass dessert dishes I had estimated at $120 closed at $280 to a woman in a red coat, who wanted them the moment she saw them. The watercolor farm scene I had been uncertain about closed at $420 to the man with white hair in the back row. If you are still in the room with me, stay. This is the part the whole story has been moving toward. Marcus brought lot 47 to the center of the floor on its dolly. The room shifted the way rooms shift when a significant object enters. I heard it in the ambient sound, someone leaning forward in a folding chair, the particular quality of silence that means phones have been put away. I said lot 47. Seth Thomas grandfather clock, walnut case, circa 1885. Original movement. Original hands. Original pendulum. One professionally executed repair to the rear panel, noted in the catalog. I have estimated this lot at $800 to $1,200. It is a significant piece, with a documented family provenance in Louisville going back to 1931. I paused. I said before I opened the bidding on this lot, I need to do one thing. I came down from the podium. I walked to the clock at the center table. I was aware of 38 people watching me, and I did not look at any of them specifically. I opened the glass door of the case. I reached into the mechanism. I lifted the pendulum cradle. I took out the note. I unfolded it carefully. I read it to myself once. Then I looked up at the room. I said I found this inside the clock mechanism during my appraisal walkthrough of this estate 3 months ago. I said it is a handwritten note on a half sheet of notebook paper. I said the handwriting belongs to Marlene Henderson, the former owner of this estate. I said the note is dated 7 years ago, and it is relevant to the provenance history of this property. I said I am going to read it. The room was very still. The clock's pendulum hung motionless. It had not been wound. I said, Pat borrowed $3,400 from my purse while I was at the hospital with Claire. She said she would return it before Claire noticed. She has not returned it. I am writing this down so I remember. I folded the note. I placed it in the breast pocket of my jacket. I looked at the room. I did not look directly at Pat or my mother. I looked at the room the way you look at it when you are running a sale, taking in the whole space and reading it. But in my peripheral vision I saw Pat's hands on the paddle handle. They were shaking. Not slightly. I heard a sound from the direction of the entrance. A chair. A movement. Marcus told me afterward that my mother had stood up, crossed the room, and walked out, through the side door. He said it took her approximately 40 seconds, from the moment I finished reading. I returned to the podium. I said the opening bid on lot 47 is $400. Do I have 400? The man with white hair raised his paddle, before the echo of the number cleared the room. 400. A dealer in the second row came in at 5. I had 6, 7, 800 in under 30 seconds. At 900 it settled to 2 bidders. At 1,000 it was 1. At 1,100 it held. Going once. Going twice. Sold. $1,100. I noted the buyer, and continued to lot 48. We closed at 12:51 in the afternoon. Total realized, $41,232, against an estimate of $36,000 to $40,000. 114 lots. 0 passed. Marcus handled the settlement paperwork. I stood at the podium, and completed the lot register entries by hand, the way Dorothy had taught me. Every lot, every buyer, every price. In sequence, in clear handwriting. I looked up once, when I reached lot 47 in the register. Pat was gone. My mother was gone. The man with white hair was at the settlement table filling out his buyer paperwork. He looked up, and caught my eye, and gave me one small nod. I nodded back. I looked at the Seth Thomas clock standing at the center of the emptying floor. I wrote in the register, lot 47, Seth Thomas grandfather clock, walnut case circa 1885. Realized, $1,100. Buyer, Wickers Estate Auctions, owner reserve, not for resale. I had bid on my own reserve, from the podium, which was within my rights, as the auctioneer of record for a lot, where the selling firm's owner wished to acquire the piece. $1,100, payable from my own account to the estate at settlement. The clock was mine. I did not hear from Pat that day, or the one after. She left a voicemail on Tuesday. She said the note was not what it looked like. She said there were circumstances I did not understand. She said Marlene had never intended for that to be found, and certainly not read in a public room. She said, Claire, I know we have had our problems, but what you did in that room was not right. I listened to the voicemail once. I did not call back. My mother called on Thursday. She said, Claire, I want to explain. I said, Mom, I don't think there is a great deal to explain. She said, there are things about that time I never told you. I said, I know. I know you never told me. I know that now. She was quiet on the line. I said, I love you. I said, I will always love you. But I am not going to Sunday dinners, and I am not going to pretend the past 7 years were a series of misunderstandings. I said, you can call me. I will pick up. I will not call you until I am ready, and I do not know when that will be. She said, okay. I said goodbye. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. James was at school. I thought about what Dorothy had told me about Brendan, the part about how some situations reach a point where neither person knows how to make the first call, and you wait too long, and then the call becomes something that cannot be made. I did not want to be the person who waited until it was too late. I also was not ready yet. Both of those things were true at the same time, and I had learned by that point in my life that two true things can occupy the same space, without one canceling the other. The Seth Thomas clock was in the corner of my living room. I had cleaned and wound it the evening I brought it home. The movement was steady. The pendulum had the quality that comes from a thing made to last, and maintained over time by someone who understood its value. James came home from school on the Friday after the auction. He dropped his backpack at the front door, his standard habit, and then stopped in the living room doorway and looked at the clock. He said, is that new? I said, it is very old. But it is ours now. He walked up and looked at the face for a moment. He said, it sounds like a heartbeat. I said, a lot of clocks do. He said, whose was it? I said, it belonged to your grandfather. He said, the one who lives in the memory place. I said, yes. He said, oh. He looked at it another moment. He said, can I learn how to wind it? I said, yes. I showed him. You open the small door on the right side of the case. There are 3 winding points inside. You use the key that hangs on a small hook just inside the door. You turn each point clockwise, gently, until you feel it catch. You do not force it. When it resists, you stop. He did it, with a patience that some children simply arrive in the world carrying, and that I had never been able to teach him directly. When he was done, he closed the door and stepped back. He said, I think Dorothy would have liked this clock. I said, I think she would have too. He picked up his backpack and went to the kitchen. I stood in the living room for a while. I thought about Dorothy placing Brendan's photograph on the podium every sale day, so he could see what she had learned too late. I thought about the 11 days on Dana's couch, with $312, and James asleep against my chest. I thought about my father at the kitchen counter, with his coffee mug, standing still, saying nothing. I thought about the woman who had written that note. She was not a monster. I wanted her to have been one. It would have been simpler. Instead, she was a woman who had written the truth down, and then had not known what to do with it, and so she had folded it, and put it somewhere she would not have to look at it, and the years had continued around the hiding place. And one day someone came into the house with a catalog notebook and the training to look underneath. The truth had waited 7 years. In the top drawer of my kitchen desk there is a half sheet of notebook paper, folded exactly as I found it, in my mother's handwriting. I kept it. Not as a weapon. Not as something to produce at a future argument. As a record. Dorothy had 31 years of ledgers in a back room, because you never know which number someone will want to dispute. I understand that now in more ways than she intended when she taught it to me. I am 34 years old. I own a business a woman named Dorothy Wickers built in 1974, with her husband Roy, and ran alone for 20 years, after he died. I have a son, who is 7 years old, and who can wind a Seth Thomas grandfather clock, with the patience of someone twice his age, and who knows, without being told, that every object has a story, and both deserve to be respected. I have a clock in my living room, that my father promised me, when I was 16. It runs well. I wind it every 8 days. And I have a mother somewhere in St. Matthews, who may or may not be ready, someday, to make a call she has been not making for 7 years. I will pick up. If you are listening to this, and someone has taken something from you and called it something else, hear me. Keep your records. Keep your receipts. Keep the handwritten notes, the dated letters, the things your family hides in the bottoms of clocks, and hopes will never be found. The truth has a long patience. It does not expire. It will wait for the right moment, and the right person to open the mechanism and find it. You may be that person. You may be the one who has to carry it home. That is not a small thing. It is the only thing. Has someone in your family folded something up and put it somewhere they hoped would never be found? I think most of us know what that feels like, from one side of the hiding or the other. And I think most of us are still waiting for the right moment to open the mechanism. My name is Claire Henderson. I am 34 years old. I know what things are worth. Thank you for staying until the gavel came down.